Welcome to the Alabama Renaissance Fair.
Also on the board of directors for the Alabama Renaissance Fair, and I'd like to welcome you to the second of our 2023 lecture series for the Alabama Renaissance Fair. Dr. Carl Franks of UNA's English department kicked us off last week with Shakespeare's Supernatural, which he did before the concert for the Shoal Symphony, where they did Shakespeare in Florence. Uh, Next week, same time, same station, Dr. Ben Lowe of the University of North Alabama History Department will be doing a program entitled For Fear, He Turned Them Out, which is a program on Tudor burn marks, superstition, and magical practices to ward off evil spirits, which kind of dovetails nicely with Dr. Franks' program from last week, where he talked about fairies, ghosts, witches, and other supernatural characters in Shakespeare's plays. This week, we are excited to have a program by Dr. Nancy Atkinson of the University of North Alabama English Department. She's no stranger to us. She's done several programs for us in the past. This is her curriculum vitae. It's like 13 pages long. So it's very impressive. I won't read all of it, but she works in the Department of English at the University of North Alabama. She has her PhD in English from the University of Pittsburgh, her MA in English from the University of Pittsburgh, her Master's of Education in Humanities Education from the University of Pittsburgh, and her BA in English from the University of Pittsburgh. She's got several professional appointments, including Professor of English at the University of North Alabama from 2014 to present. I think some of her students are here, so I don't need to go over all of her accomplishments because you all know it. She's done several great programs for us in the past on medieval female saints, which I found very interesting. She did one on Richard III last year, which was very interesting. So this year she's going to be speaking on the secrets of Lady Margaret Clitherow or Clitherow? Clitherow, an English Catholic martyr during the Protestant Reformation. So I'll let her.
What does this do?
That is a remote control if you needed it for the slideshow.
Does it go like?
Yeah, it will advance.
Do I have to advance it?
You just, this button here goes forward. So right is forward, left is backwards.
Okay.
And I can try to slide this over so you don't need to see.
Right. Oh, that's pretty good.
So you can see what slide
Okay,
slides up.
Margaret Clitherow's hand. When I went to York several years ago to do research on Margaret Clitherow, I learned that she had a relic, and of course, sometimes relics aren't exactly real. I think you have to take them with a grain of salt. And the interesting story behind that is because the hotel I was staying at mentioned it was at a place called Bar Convent. And that was just like outside the wall. And it's great. There is in York, there's still the medieval wall, which I didn't know when I got off the train, and I'm like, it fell to the ground. A medieval wall. You know, I was so excited about that wall. I walked that wall every day I was there. But anyway, this hand is in that convent. And they were closed and they were doing remodeling, but I called them and I said, I'm here from the United States. I'm studying Margaret Clitherow. And I was so anxious to see your hand of Margaret Clitherow that they personally gave me a tour. Now, what was interesting is usually they had this hand set out as a relic that people would look at, but because they were doing this remodeling, they had it in what's called a priest hole. If you read the literature on this subject, that's what they call it, a priest hole. And this was very much like, and because the head nun took me there, she went and she, opened up the secret trap door in the church, which no one would know about. And then she pulled out the hand, and so I was able to photograph it. And so they still have it there. Now it's open and everybody can see the hand. This is the Pearl of Europe. That's what they call Margaret Clitherow. This is within her shrine. Okay, Margaret Clitherow didn't have a priest's hole. What she did, and you know her house is still there. It's in the place called the Shambles, which is it's a road that's not bigger than this post to this post. It's very small, and then they have these overhang second story. Hers was in a neighbor's house, and as I tell her story, you will you can imagine. They put this mannequin here, and they have this extremely good-looking mannequin, which is hardly how you would imagine her elderly priest, but you know, that's the mannequin that they put in there so you can see that you know, it's a place to hide priests. This is within her shrine. Her shrine is across the street from her house. And this is on the Ouse Bridge, which is an important part of the story, where she dies, and they put a placard there. That's a statue of her in the shrine. I think there's maybe another, maybe.
Yeah, put them on there so it would loop. So there, several
Okay,
of them are
so-
on there more than once.
Well, okay, I'll leave this go. Well, I'm gonna leave the hand up. Since it's Halloween and everybody else doing talks here had Halloween presentations. The Secrets of Margaret Clitherow. Margaret Clitherow was a Catholic convert who was born in New York in 1553. She was the daughter of Thomas and Jane Middleton. At 18, she married a well-to-do butcher named John Clitherow at St. Martin's Coney Street Church. John conformed to Protestantism and attended the parish church. But in June of 1576, it was clear that Margaret refused to conform because she was forced to appear before the Lord Mayor and aldermen for recusancy, or refusal to submit to the illegal authority to attend church. The people who did this were called recusants. Recusants. It's not an easy word to pronounce. It's typically those in England who refuse to conform. Clitherow was one of only 3 women executed in Elizabeth's England. But women were numerous on lists of those who had refused to attend Protestant services. Women were also active in harboring priests, a practice that flouted the statute of 1585 that made assisting priests into a felony. Clitherow's position as a butcher's wife contributed to her abilities to move beyond the confines of the household. Her husband John made trips frequently, leaving her in control of the business. She had the freedom to meet fellow Catholics and organize masses. Unlike many early modern women whose actions were controlled by their husbands, Clitherow had more autonomy. Clitherow's life is detailed in John Mush's True report of the life and martyrdom of Mrs. Margaret Clitherow. His work is a revelation of secrets that she confided to him as her priest. In this talk, I will discuss those secrets: her fasting, her illegal pilgrimages, her organizations of masses in prison, her giving shelter to priests, and her cross-dressing the night before she is executed. By stressing how Clitherow needs to hide her words and actions, Mush's narrative calls attention to ways that local Protestant authorities in York silenced and oppressed Catholics. Mush contends that Clitherow's execution, the execution of priests, and the loss of holy sites are means to eradicate Catholicism in England. Lamenting this destruction in repetitive rhetoric, he writes, quote, "Now not one religious house standeth, no one altar unraised and undefiled, no one church from heretics and heresy, not one sacrament rightly administered, not one religious person to be found, not one priest, but judged as a traitor or able to escape unmurdered." End quote. He argues that this travesty is ironic, as the destruction is all part of a divine plan to bring about the restitution of the, quote, true faith. In the church's infancy, heretics and infidels devoured Christian children, he writes. Now an aged mother church must fight with blood to save those she hath borne, that the lily roots being watered with the fruitful liquor of blood may keep and yield new branches, end quote. The blood of innocent people like Margaret Clitherow will bring forth new branches of the faithful. Mush's metaphors also characterize the, quote, violent tempest of Protestantism, end quote, as a temporary problem, a radical divergence from the ancient church that will subside. Mush's manuscript was circulated soon after Clitherow's brutal execution, and his description of events would have been called into question if he had simply invented her story. It shows a resistant and independent Clitherow who takes control of her domestic space and makes dangerous changes to accommodate priests. In this talk, I will argue that the figure of Clitherow maintains a strong presence throughout Mush's narrative. Not only does she challenge secular Protestant authorities, but she also disrupts normative assumptions of gender by imitating her male priests and dressing in priestly vestments before her death. Through his disclosure of Clitherow's secrets, Mush exposes that his heroine is more like a hero, as she longs to be just like her male priests who were executed at the gallows in Knavesmere. To reveal Clitherow's valor in the Protestant war against Catholics, Mush's first chapter begins with the end of her life. He figures the saint as a warrior, conquering both her enemies and death, and explaining that Clitherow converted to Catholicism because she found no substance, truth, nor Christian comfort in the ministers of the new gospel. Clitherow embraces Catholicism and looks back on her pre-conversion life as a damnable state. Not only did Clitherow resist religious conformity, but she also resisted gender conformity. Much shows that she was even willing to leave her husband and her worldly friends. Further, Clitherow's love for God, quote, inflamed her in such marvelous sort that it overruled all worldly fears and natural inclinations in her, end quote. After she converts, Clitherow emulates her priests by overcoming the desires of the flesh and becoming chaste. She is also so courageous that she has no fear of, quote, the flesh, nor the devil, neither yet all the cruelty that hell gates, heretics, and other creatures, end quote. Using her words, Much writes, quote, I will not be afraid to serve God and do well. This is a war and trial in God's church, and therefore, if I cannot do my duty without peril and danger, yet by God's grace, I will not be a slacker for them. If God's priests dare venture themselves to my home, I will never refuse them, end quote. In the battle for God's church, she is a soldier willing to give shelter to priests. Clitherow's ability to overcome herself or not give in to fleshly desires illustrates her saintliness. Mosh reveals her virtue of fasting, a virtue that she tried to keep secret. If she is invited to a banquet or a wedding, she rides a horse out of the city and meets a woman who would go to the feast in her place. This ruse allows Clitherow to meet with her priest for instructions. Even though she refers to this deception as her pilgrimage, it was not nearly as risky as her pilgrimages to the gallows, the site where her priest, some Catholic laymen, and criminals were executed. Unlike medieval and early 16th century pilgrims who followed a standard route to an established shrine, Clitherow creates her own path to her own shrine, the gallows. She manages to perform penitential acts at night in secret when her husband John is away from home. For Clitherow, it is literally a movement away from the butcher shop, a site where animals were driven and slaughtered, toward the place where her own priests were slaughtered for their faith. It is also a symbolic journey toward her own salvation. Her determination to honor the execution site by making it her pilgrimage flouted the laws established decades earlier. Pilgrimages had been banned years before Clitherow was born in 1553. The injunction of 1538 condemned worship at shrines, at images and pilgrimages to shrines. Clergy were forced to publicly recant any support for pilgrimages. For English Protestants, pilgrimages were pointless because there were no sanctified sites. This very different notion was a dramatic shift in how believers were expected to try to be physically closer to God or his saints by journeying to a holy site. And for some zealous Protestants, pilgrimages were filthy practices that underpinned, quote, a false and wicked system of faith, end quote. Because pilgrimage involved the journey to a shrine, and because avid Protestants such as Calvin and his disciples saw devotions at shrines as idolatry, a heinous sin linked to paganism, any practice involving the worship of images was demonized as spiritual fornication. Attempting to turn what was viewed as holy into the profane, their volatile language forged connections between Catholic shrines, the sins of idolatry, unlawful sexuality, and paganism. Unlike her medieval predecessors, who both permitted and encouraged, who were permitted and encouraged to go on a pilgrimage, Clitherow must make illegal pilgrimages and is concerned that spies will report her. Mush's disclosure of her courageous but clandestine actions illustrates the power of the local and royal authorities to regulate behavior. The closest means for Clitherow to pursue her devotion was to cross over the Ouse River via Ouse Bridge. This bridge held a multi-level prison with the lowest part close to the water than prisoners that died of illnesses, so close to the water that they died of illnesses. It held her fellow Catholics, ones who were willing to sacrifice their freedom and their lives for their faith. After crossing the Ouse River, Clitherow traveled on Micklegate Road and to the bar, the exit from the cities whose walls are present still. Mush states that she wanted to make her pilgrimage as frequently as she could, and he details her secret journey. Quote, after the priests had first suffered martyrdom at Knavesmere, all which at most had been her ghostly fathers, and by their holy blood and death had sanctified their reproachful gallows, she greatly desired often to visit that place, for she called it her pilgrimage. Thither she would go, accompanied with 2 or 3 virtuous women. This being the common place for execution for all sorts of malefactors, distant half a mile from the city of York, made the passage sometimes more difficult to her, because she might not adventure thither, but by night, because of spies, and only at such time as her husband was from home. End quote. To emphasize her courage, Mush highlights the many dangers she overcomes to worship at the gallows. He writes, quote, as I remember, she went barefoot to the place, and kneeling on her bare knees, ever under the gallows, meditated and prayed as long as her company would suffer that, her. End quote. Clitherow treats the site as holy ground and secretly defies the will of the local Protestant authorities. Revealing how Clitherow is a secret servant of God is an overarching theme of Mush's narrative. Her pilgrimage is secret. She finds secret ways to learn about her faith from the time she converts, and she creates secret chambers for priests to hide. She makes secret gestures to priests when she hopes to hear an exhortation. She and all who continue to practice their faith may do so in secret. But Mush makes a point to say none of their worship is secret to God. For 12 years, Clitherow is tossed in the waves of tribulation, as Mush puts it. She is first imprisoned in 1577 in York Castle for not attending Protestant services, and she remains there for nearly a year. Her husband John pays fines for her recusancy in 1578 and 1579, but in 1580, when she refuses to take the conformity oath, she is imprisoned for 6 months and released only to bear her child. Clitherow is again imprisoned in the castle for 2 months until she's freed on bond. Not only does Mush's narrative display that Clitherow resists religious conformity, but it also exposes that she welcomes her time of imprisonment. When incarcerated, she is able to fast 4 days a week and able to learn to read and communicate with priests. He says that, quote, the prison she encountered, a most happy and profitable school, where the servants of God, as delivered from all worldly cares and business, might learn commodiously every Christian virtue, end quote. Comparing her to learned men, Mush exclaims, quote, I have greatly marveled oftentimes how she, being an unlearned woman, tossed up and down in worldly business, except only in her time of imprisonment, where she learned to read English and written hand, could attain that humility to which I know few faithful clerks to have reached nigh, end quote. Mush emphasizes that Clitherow benefits significantly from her imprisonment. It is as if she wants to show her persecutors, it is as if he wants to show her persecutors just how oblivious they are to the effects of their imprisonment. Protestants fail in their attempts to convert Catholics by punitive means. Mush's work illustrates the irony that the punishments only increase Catholic piety. For Clitherow, it means an escape from household duties and the freedom to learn to read. Part of his point in revealing Clitherow's secrets is to highlight the irony that oppressive means are not eliminating Catholicism. Rather, the punishment expands devotion. Prisons gave Catholics the opportunity to strengthen their identities. They enabled Catholics to separate themselves physically from the Protestants, even though Protestant ministers attempted to convince prisoners to change their faith. Mush's use of repetition foregrounds the way that Protestants undermine their own objectives by punishing Clitherow. He writes, quote, they shut her up in close prison, and she learned thereby to forget and despise the world. They separated her from house, children, and husband, and she thereby became familiar with God. They sought to terrify her, and she thereby increased in most glorious constancy and fortitude, end quote. Clitherow, as a lily root that produces new growth, assists fellow Catholics in their worship by organizing masses in prison. Mush's metaphors of the new growth of the Catholic faith underscore his argument despite the razing and defiling of Catholic sites. More holy sites spring up, even unlikely ones like prison. Embedded in a prayer, Mush describes how he witnessed Clitherow assist imprisoned Catholics. Quote, she has looked to their bodily needs and procured discretion. With how much gladness hath she gathered together by 10 or 12 thy poor Catholic people at once, and brought to pass, first, to have them purified and fed with thy gracious sacraments, then their bodies refreshed with meat and drink. End quote. Clitherow's work is similar to a liturgical coordinator, one who both responds to the physical needs of the people and arranges the administration of sacraments. Ironically, in this prison setting, she defies the laws against Catholic ritual practice, and she is free to take on a leadership role. Immediately after Clitherow is released from prison, she spurns the laws against harboring priests by designating 2 secret rooms, one in the house next to hers, and the other farther away from home but accessible to priests. Much divulges that the second location is created for, quote, more troublesome and dangerous times, end quote. At her secret distant chamber, she is able to experience Mass. The experience of the Mass gives pleasure to Clitherow because it brings God, quote, into the secret parlor of her heart, end quote. The image of God entering Clitherow's heart mirrors the external construction of the secret places where Catholics distance themselves from Protestant authorities. She tries to avoid conflict with local Protestant authorities, but she becomes notorious. She is betrayed by her own zeal. Those who knew her expected that she would not be without a priest. Mush attributes her legal trouble to her revealing the priest's secret escape route to children, but he also argues that her revelation of this secret was part of a divine plan. The chapters on Clitherow's apprehension, examination, trial, and execution are included with the account attributed to Mush, but they appear to be written by another writer, possibly Thomas Hutton. Unlike Mush's first-person metaphoric account that moves from descriptions of Clitherow's virtues to direct addresses to readers and prayers to God, these chapters are composed as a linear action story, but the concluding chapter was written by Mush. The linear narrative reveals how her secret places are discovered. The counselors at York demand that her husband John appear before them on the morning of March 10, 1586. But after he reports, they tell him to return that afternoon. Fearing the authorities will search their house, Clitherow runs to a priest who have informed him of the potential danger. Sheriffs conduct a search of her house, but they find that she is only busy with household duties. Because they are warned, her priest and fellow Catholics manage to evade capture. Not everyone escapes, though. Her children's Catholic schoolmaster is discovered. Thinking that the schoolmaster is a priest, one of the sheriff's men runs to obtain help from the others performing the raid. Panicked, the schoolmaster uses the escape route from Clitherow's house into the priest's chamber while the children watch. These chapters depict the authorities as wild animals. The schoolmaster narrowly escapes their paws, and the enraged searchers who are greedy of prey take the children, servants, and Clitherow. Because the authorities are hell-bent in finding some evidence of Clitherow's guilt, they strip one of the boys of his clothing and threaten to beat him if he does not reveal the priest's chamber that they imagine is filled with incriminating items or the spoil. The boy exposes the secret room, and as a result, Clitherow is imprisoned. When she arrives at the jail, she is so wet that she has to borrow clothing to keep warm. Catherine Longley suggests that Clitherow was ducked, purposely so, because a ducking stool was on the route she would have traveled to jail. The raid occurs in the afternoon, when the searchers would be assured that no priest would be saying Mass, because priests were required to say Mass in the mornings. This detail suggests that the authorities did not want to catch a priest who would become the central focus. They appear to have wanted to arrest Clitherow. Even though she is arrested on a felony charge, Clitherow does not act fearful of the Protestant authorities. The account informs readers that before she is arraigned, she sees 35 of her fellow Catholics through the window. To make them happy, she makes a symbolic gesture. Quote, looking forth of a window toward them, they were 35, and might easily behold her from thence. She made a pair of gallows on her fingers, and pleasantly laughed at them, end quote. That she makes the figure of the gallows clearly indicates that she envisions that her own fate will be like her priests, and she will be publicly hung. Clitherow is indicted for harboring priests and hearing Mass. It is a very serious charge, but the writer presents her indictment like a drama, replete with devilish comic characters. The judge accuses her of maintaining both Jesuit and seminary priests who are the Queen's enemies. While smiling at them, she denies the accusation. She insists that she has not offended and therefore should have no trial. The account stresses how the physical evidence against her, the objects of Catholic worship, become the props in an anti-Catholic play. Quote, then they brought forth 2 chalices, diverse pictures, and in mockery put on 2 vestments and other church gear on 2 lewd fellows' backs. And in derision, the one began to pull and dally with the other, scoffing on the bench before the judges, and holding up the singing breads, and said to the martyr, behold thy gods in who thou believest. End quote. Despite this display, Clitherow refuses to make a plea. A plea of innocence would force her children and servants to testify against her. If she were found guilty, they would have contributed to her punishment. Even though the judge tries to persuade her that she should plead her innocence, she refuses to do so. Women were expected to be silent and defer to men within the home, but Clitherow extends the silence expected of women to the courtroom and publicly resists the pressure to be obedient and plead. The narrative describes the judge's sentence on her. Quote, you must return from whence you came, and there, in the lowest part of the prison, be stripped naked, laid down, your back upon the ground, and as much weight laid upon you as you are able to bear, and so continue 3 days without meat or drink, except a little barley bread and puddle water. And on the 3rd day, to be pressed to death, your hands and feet tied to posts, and a sharp stone under your back. End quote. Clitherow's sentence is very unlike the priests who are publicly humiliated and hung at the gallows. Her execution is held out of the public's view. After her sentence is articulated, her hands are tied and she is led back to prison. Fashioned as predators, Clitherow's accusers insist on her torturous death. The true report states that Counselor Huddleston says, quote, "She is the only woman in the northern parts, and if she is suffered to live, there will be more of her order without any fear of the law," end quote. He makes it appear as if they will have an uprising of women flouting their laws. Clitherow is not permitted to make a last confession to a priest, nor is she able to receive the sacrament before she dies. In the absence of a priest or Catholic rite, Clitherow tries to make her last moments of her life and death into a meaningful act of piety. She transforms her punishment and imminent execution into a ritual. She enacts the form of pilgrimage in her own prison cell, creating herself as the male figure of the church. Describing one of Clitherow's inmates' observations of her on the night before her death, the account states, quote, "At 12 of the o'clock, she saw the martyr rise from her knees and put off all her apparel, putting on a linen habit like to an alb, which she had made with her own hands 3 days before to suffer martyrdom in. Then she kneeled down again, and without anything upon her saving that linen cloth, from 12 of the o'clock until 3, at which time she arose and came to the fireside. There she laid down flat upon the stones 1/4 of an hour. After that she arose and went to bed, covering herself with clothes, and so continued until 6 in the morning. Then she arose and put on her apparel, made her ready against the sheriff's coming," end quote. Aware that she will be laid down on stones and pressed to death instead of dying like the men she longs to imitate, she makes her own priest's attire, the alb, and wears it while lying down flat on the stones. In the morning, she dons her own clothing. The image of Clitherow dressed in a priest's white vestment suggests that she imagines herself taking on their identities. Although readers of the true report must envision Clitherow's mental processes through an inmate's report, the representation clearly transgresses gender and social norms. As Elizabethan sumptuary laws regulated dress according to a person's social standing. Moralists railed against cross-dressing, citing 1 Deuteronomy 22, verse 5, quote, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are an abomination unto the Lord thy God," end quote. By wearing priestly vestments, Clitherow spurns both biblical and gender restrictions on clothing, but she does so in secret. As she walks toward the toll booth where she will die, she carries her handmade linen habit and smiles at the people who have gathered to watch her as she walks. As if to limit the public's view of Clitherow, the sheriff hurries her onward. At the toll booth, the women who attend her drop down on their knees and beg the sheriff that Clitherow be permitted to remain clothed, but he repeats the judge's order that she be stripped. The women take off her clothes. She lies down, and they place the linen habit, which is the alb, over her. To hold the stones that they will put on her, they place a door over her body. The sheriff insists that she must have her hands bound, and she puts joined hands over the door. Two of the sergeants helping with the execution pull her hands apart and tie them to posts with the string she had made for herself. It is clear that she hoped that her arms would be stretched and tied to posts, so that her body and arms would make a perfect cross. They put a sharp stone under her back and put 700 to 800 pounds of weight on the door. Her ribs break and burst out of her chest. Clitherow dies in 15 minutes. Even in the last moments of her life, she is covered with her handmade alb. She assumes the very body position symbolic of Christ's sacrifice. Clithero's dying body forms the shape of the cross, and in the larger context of reformers' physical attacks on Catholic iconography, even crosses, her last act of making a cross with her body is one of utter defiance. For Mush, those who aided in her death are beaten and confused. Clitherow dies a glorious death, and Protestants who demean her will not convince anyone except those who, quote, wallow in the same abominable puddle of uncleanliness with them, end quote. Not only does Mush attribute to Clitherow those characteristics that are traditionally viewed as male, but his work highlights that she emulates both Christ and her slain priests. Throughout the narrative, Mush exposes Clitherow's secrets: her fasting and abstaining from other desires of the flesh, her pilgrimages that allow her to meet with priests instead of feasting with friends, her cautious travel at night to the gallows when her husband is away, her organization of masses in prison, her means of accommodating and harboring priests, and her ritual practice before her own clandestine execution. That so much of Clitherow's action had to be kept secret from the local Protestant authorities illustrates the extent of the silencing and oppression of Catholics in York. Clitherow's resistance to this oppression is epitomized in her accuser's claim that if she is allowed to live, then others will have no fear of law and will emerge. By making public what is private, Mush argues that the larger irony in this tragedy is that God has turned Clitherow's murder into a means of honoring her as a saint. Her accusers have been part of God's plan to sanctify Clitherow. They may have silenced her by killing her, but other Catholics will still refuse to conform. His work ultimately makes Clitherow the central focus, the active agent, and the fruitful liqueur that will enable the growth to come.
Does anybody have any questions? I have one. Is the hand, is it considered an actual relic or more of a curiosity? In other words, if a practicing Catholic as an act of devotion wanted to visit Margaret's relics, is there a church anywhere or would they go there?
There's relics in every single Catholic church.
Yeah, but if you wanted to venerate Margaret's relics, are those actual relics for veneration or more of a curiosity in a museum?
The nuns say they're the relics.
Oh, so those are actually, so it is.
No, I'm not saying that they're the actual relics.
No, I understand. I'm
I'm
just
saying
saying.
the nuns claim that this is the actual relic,
But
that's
they-
kept in a convent.
Okay, so yeah, okay, that, I got you. So it's actually in a convent. They venerate them as actual relics. Okay, got it.
But they would have been in any
Yeah.
church. I mean,
Yeah, I know every church has I missed the part about how that's an actual practicing convent. So now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's
It
an
is.
actual convent. It's not a museum. Okay.
Do you think they stripped her naked to embarrass her, and in that way make it so no one would want to follow her for that embarrassment, that public humiliation thing? Do you think that's why they was
Yeah,
refused to allow?
I do think that that's part of it. I mean, because it would be a sign for other women who would be afraid. You mean strip her? Well, if she's naked on the stones, I mean, the rock put underneath her that actually kills her, the sharp rock under her back, would go through faster. But I don't think they're thinking about her lack of suffering. That, as you probably noted, what actually happens is not what the judge sentences. I mean, he sentenced her to 3 days, and this is just half.
Instance, yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
So did you say that she was one of 3 women executed?
Yes,
Were
but
the
there were
others-
loads of men executed.
Were the other women executed similarly? Or do we know?
I don't think that there has to be a narrative. And this narrative, interestingly, though it was printed shortly afterwards, and it circulated, in amongst Catholics, though it's clear in parts that I didn't put in here, it's clear that Mush is also talking to Protestants. It wasn't able to actually be published until the 19th century, when there's not such animosity toward Catholics. And so I'm sure those other women are just lists on a list in a book, and there's nothing to say about that except that they were executed.
And did I read somewhere that Margaret was canonized by
Yeah.
Paul VI? Was it Paul VI or John the 23rd?
Pope Paul VI.
Yeah, I thought it was Paul. 1970? She was canonized, so not that long ago.
Yes, no, it was fairly recently in, the history of canonization. She was canonized with others who resisted Protestantism at the time.
Are there any miracles associated with her?
No,
Okay, just
no miracles. That's what makes her very different from most of the saints that I have worked on. But they are not as late as the 16th century. But, I mean, you could find other, like 19th century miracles, but there isn't anything that's miraculous.
with her.
She was sainted because she was a martyr, not the miracles.
Okay. I was just because I was reading on Edward the Confessor the other day, and none of he didn't do any miracles, and they canonized him 100 years after he died. They finally gave him.
Yes, in the early and Middle Ages, they canonized people very easily.
Yeah.
Now it's much harder. Although, the Pope, John Paul, is canonized. And I'm not sure what the miracles are about that, but I was really surprised to have known someone in his life and then was canonized.
There's another female saint here recently. Her body was incorrupt,
In Ohio?
Who?
I can't remember right now. I'm not Catholic. I just remember reading about it. I was studying, and you know me, I went off on a tangent. But she died quite a while back, and they dug her up, and her body was still.
That's a lot of reason why they canonized, because
Yeah.
they were moving the body to a shrine, and then they found that they weren't decayed. At least that's what's said.
Margaret's actions limited to priests, or
What do
was
you
she known
mean?
to harbor other people that
No,
were
it-
Catholic practicing?
You mean other Catholics? No, it was priests. You know, I mean, there's only one space. Well, I mean, she's got the Catholic schoolmaster in her house, so, I mean, but she wasn't hiding here.
And the dressing as a man, if I remember correctly, one of the only charges the ecclesiastical court could make stick against Joan of Arc was wearing a man's armor and weapons, even though she'd gotten the dispensation from a church court at Orleans to do so. You know, for the English and Burgundians, don't bother us with facts. We've already made our mind up. So one of the only things they could make stick with Joan is dressing like a man.
Yes.
It's just convenient, you know.
Yes.
Don't bother us with the
I can't
facts.
even bear teaching
Yeah.
Joan of Arc stuff. I can't bear teaching. It upsets me so much that.
Yeah, she
you know,
she got used. There's no doubt about it. When her usefulness was up, it's okay. Highest bidder.
Right. Yeah, Brenna.
The gentleman who wrote the account,
I can't hear you, Brenna.
Oh, the gentleman who wrote the account of her life, is it Mush? Is that
John Mush.
John Mush?
M-U-S-H.
Yeah. In compiling his account, was he able to contact any people who knew her personally? What do we know about the process?
He knew her personally.
So he knew her
He was her
personally.
priest.
Ah, okay. And he
And
knew the other
writes
priests
this
who she
a
helped
couple
save.
months after. The reason he's so upset
Mhm.
to write this is because he was her priest, and he knew the other priests that were her priests that had been executed. He escapes execution, though. He does go to the convent, so he's not. I mean, after this happens, he goes to the convent, and he's not. All they need to do. One part that I didn't put in here is Clitherow sent her son, not telling her husband, sent her son to be educated as a priest in France, and her daughter then goes there too. And she leaves her daughter her shoes to indicate she wants her to follow in her footsteps.
Do we know anything about what happened to the children? Did they ever return to England?
I
Did
have no idea. No,
Yeah.
this is. This isn't in any history books. This is really just it's in a number of texts called The Troubles of Our Catholic Forefathers. It was printed in the 19th century. But scholars have taken an interest, and several people have written on her because she was a female that you could talk about in this early period.
Mhm.
And there's so little to talk about.
Do you plan to do more work on her? Are you
I
thinking?
sent this out as an article. I
Okay.
sent this out as an article. I'm waiting to hear on it. We'll see.
Yeah. Which publication?
16th Century Journal. But I got like a list of after that because, I got a list of if it gets rejected, I'm going to this one. If it gets rejected, I'm going to this one. I had a professor who told me, don't change a word until you get 6 rejections. I sent the article out to Early Modern Women's Journal International, and I was kind of not looking at that word international enough. And I got a really nice, respectful letter. 3 editors had read it, but they felt it wasn't international. And they said that, well, it is. It's about one woman, and she's in one place in England. And the issue, so they wanted me to make it more about the issue of Catholicism and internationalize it. But I mean, to took me a long time to focus this, and I'm not gonna do that, so I sent it elsewhere. Because you can't listen to every advice from every editor, unless you're rejected 6 times. I take that advice seriously. I sent it out within 3 or 4 more days. And I have others to go if 16th Century Journal doesn't want. I check on this. It's weird how they do it now. You give you a number and you can check on your status. It's so different.
We're not going to tell you to your face you've been rejected. We'll make you look it up and you say,
Yes.
Yeah.
That's all right. I mean, if you're in this business of being a professor, you get used to rejection. You get used to it. You learn from the rejection.
that or actors, I'm sorry, you didn't get the part. They got the part. So
Well, it's just
thick skin, I
once
guess.
you've got it. Yes. Well, I have very thick skin. It's not the lead. I mean, getting rejected is depressing for a day, but there are bigger problems that that I can worry about. So we'll see what happens. I'll go down my list, but the article I excerpted what I thought would interest this audience the best, and so the article's got a lot more of other people, of course, other scholars, the ones who've written it. There haven't been that many, I think like 4 or 5 that have written on her. Other questions? Yes.
Do we have any idea about who might have preserved her hand? Could it be
No.
someone like John Mush?
No, I'm sure that if he had something to do with the hand, we would have known it. We'd
Okay.
been in there. I don't think that's her hand. I don't really believe that's her hand. I mean, think of all the relics. There's no possible way. Although, St. John Paul, I remember that some of the people that are closer to my age would remember when John Paul was shot. Remember? And of course, they put a cloth on him to hold him. Well, that cloth became a relic, and it was in a Polish church, and then somebody stole it. So a lot of things that have to do with the saint besides the body part, of course. And Poland wanted to chop them up for body parts. Did you know that? And the Vatican says, we don't do that anymore. Poland said, well, we want to put them in every church. And, that's what we have. And,
Put a scrap of the cloth in every church.
yeah, well,
There's other ways to get around that.
yeah, except someone stole it.
Yeah, well,
Probably using it for eating purposes.
he had
That's
other
what the
clothes. He
relics
had
are.
other garments, though. I mean, they could take some of his vestments, or maybe it's
I was
kind of.
kind of bummed out that they didn't chop them up and put in places, because I've always been interested in that subject of relics.
Yeah, especially the undecayed
What's the
relics.
difference? What's the difference? I mean, if you're in a, no, but then, of course he's in a tomb in the Vatican with all the other popes, so you have, there's that. But it's just that he was the first Polish pope. Anything else? I appreciate everybody listening to me today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I got a couple of closing announcements. It's like church. We can't leave without closing announcements. Of course, everybody, this is Renaissance Month. We have one final lecture next week. Dr. Ben Lowe, and for Faire, he turned them out. Tudor burn marks and popular magic to ward off or trap evil spirits, which I'm very intrigued by. Dr. Lowe's a geek like the rest of us, so he always makes his programs interesting. And then remember the Renaissance Feast coming up Saturday, October 21st at 6 p.m. at the Coliseum. The tickets are on sale now. And then the big thing is the Renaissance Fair, which is a Saturday and Sunday, October 28th and 29th at Fountain on the Green, aka Woodrow Wilson Park, right over there. Again, thank you, Dr. Atkinson. That was really interesting. I love stuff like that. I like stuff that nobody else has written a lot about. So that intrigues me. So thanks for being here.
Oh, my stars and garters.
I like stuff.
I don't know.